Well, let's stay with biodiversity, which is the theme of the day at the COP27, those UN climate change talks taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh. Let's talk to the environmental think tank InfluenceMap, which suggests that some of the world's biggest companies are actively lobbying against policies which aim to protect biodiversity. It made that claim in a recent report, and the author of that is Rebecca Vaughan. Welcome to the programme. Just briefly tell us how you compiled this report and how you know the extent of this supposed lobbying by companies.
Research looked at the advocacy activities of 12 business groups on biodiversity-related policy and regulation, and we define this as any policy that aims to address a major driver of biodiversity loss, for example, deforestation, overfishing, or pesticide use. And these 12 business groups represent companies from a wide range of sectors, including many of the world's largest companies.
Right, and where in the world are these companies largely based then?
So as an initial step, we looked at European and US industry groups. And so most of these companies are from those regions, although some are from other regions as well.
Right, and you know the extent of this lobbying how? Because they have been doing it publicly?
Yes, so we analysed hundreds of examples of lobbying by these groups, including what they're saying to policymakers in consultations, what they're saying in meetings with policymakers, and also what they're saying on their websites. And we found that they were overwhelmingly pushing to delay, dilute, or roll back policy. And in fact, just under 90% of all instances of lobbying that we looked at were found to be negative.
Right. And it is the job of companies, isn't it, to kind of advocate for their business, for their shareholders, some of whom are pension funds and therefore do a social good. Companies employ people after all. Any evidence that policymakers took on board the lobbying suggestions from these companies that a lot of the policies were delayed, diluted, rolled back?
Yeah, so one example that we saw was under the Trump administration in the US, industry associations were pretty successful, in fact, in lobbying and rolling back quite a wide range of policy, including policies like the Endangered Species Act, which protects a number of species in the US, and also clean water rules. And we're still seeing the Biden administration try to reverse these rollbacks, but still facing a lot of industry lobbying there. In the EU, maybe slightly less success, but definitely examples of regulations being delayed or watered down in the process.
And that is on politicians, isn't it? That is on policymakers, not on the companies that are lobbying.
So we're not suggesting that there's anything illegitimate about what companies are doing, but we have noticed that many of the companies have statements around protecting biodiversity on their websites, but at the same time are the members of these organisations actively lobbying against action. So we think it's important that they consider whether the actions of these business groups are really aligned with their values or in fact undermining their own efforts.
Right. So what would you like to change then? Because you did acknowledge earlier on that these companies are making these lobbying efforts publicly. It's not something that's happening in secret behind closed doors.
Yeah, so we're not advocating what policymakers should do in particular, but we think that our data can be really useful to understand the bigger picture of industry advocacy and understand how it aligns with the ambitions of policymakers and the science of the IPBES. We also think that more transparency is needed. I mean, we found a lot of lobbying happen in public, but we really think this is probably the tip of the iceberg, and it's important to understand what's going on behind closed doors too.
Right, so you're saying a lot of these large companies then are slightly hypocritical. They're saying one thing in maybe their marketing materials, but they're doing something else when they're meeting politicians.
That's possible. We also, something that we see in the work that we do on climate change is that some of these industry groups don't always accurately represent the majority of their members, but sometimes take the sort of lowest position among their membership. So we think it's important that companies are really aware of what their industry associations are saying so that they can analyse themselves whether they think that they align with their values.
Thank you. Rebecca Vaughan there, the author of that report from InfluenceMap. You're with Newsday on the BBC. Stay with us if you can.